The apologist David Wood recently made a video, "Did Jesus Exist?" subtitle Jesus Mythers. And he would throw you, and as well as anyone else who's a mythicist, Christ mythicist, as a conspiracy theorist, an anti-theist, a God-hater, a flat earther, a tinfoil hat-wearing fool, someone who's absurd, and he thinks the question is just absolutely ridiculous. He quotes and uses Gary Habermas, he uses William Lane Craig in the video. Of course, Dr. Ehrman is his #1 tool, because why not use an atheist against atheists? And he's known for this for quite some time. He uses the typical arguments that we've heard. Is it that absurd? Is this question of did Jesus exist really that ridiculous, or is it taboo? Is it one of those questions that we shouldn't ask, rather than it being a ridiculous idea?
Well, I noticed that, well, first let me clarify one thing. I don't see this as being part and parcel of atheism. I know a lot of atheists who believe Jesus existed, who are not hostile to the historical Jesus they think did exist, and they just don't believe in God. And I think the important point is that there may well have been a historical Jesus, even if there is no God. And conversely, there might be a God, even if there was no historical Jesus. The two things don't have to go together. In fact, to me, they really have nothing to do with each other. I feel like the question of the existence of God is more of a philosophical one. It doesn't make sense to argue it on these grounds. And so I'm not arguing for atheism. I guess I'm kind of agnostic in that I feel like there's no sufficient evidence to believe in God. I used to. I was very, very devout for many years and so forth. And I wound up thinking that it just doesn't, the world is not the way it should be if the claims about God are true. Now, how would I know, right? I mean, I can't know such a thing. I'm just a puny human. But I'm not dogmatic about it. Once I heard a guy at a secular humanist conference who had been a Pentecostal minister in Sweden, I think, and he made this incredible statement, "Now I'm free to be able to say, I hate God." And I thought you didn't think there was a God, but you do apparently because you hate God. Is that right? It's just crazy. I tend not to even want to associate with atheists because often their moral code is abhorrent. Their politics seem to me lunatic, and they're pointlessly antagonistic. It's like they lie awake at night thinking, I don't think people hate us quite enough. Is there something else we could do to make ourselves even more obnoxious and offensive? So I'm not really in sympathy with them. It's just my position currently that I think there is probably no God. Similarly, with the historical Jesus, I don't have a dogma that Jesus didn't exist, darn it. No, it's a historical question, and anybody that knows historical method knows that all of these judgments have to be provisional and tentative, and you never know what evidence is going to turn up. You never know what, like for instance, people used to think that St. Irenaeus was unfair to the Gnostics, and we can't trust what he says about them. And then they discovered the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945. Turns out he knew what he was talking about. We can even pinpoint the documents he was looking at and fairly representing, right? Or how about the Hitler diaries? Oh, what do you know? The Fuhrer doesn't look so bad. Oops, they're forgeries. So if that can happen, you may have to reevaluate evidence. It's always tentative. You never know what for sure. So dogmatic. I mean, there's certain things that practically you can know, like the Holocaust, horror of horrors. My father was present at the liberation of Dachau and wrote it up and told us about it. I have no reason at all to doubt that. It's possible in the remote future, when the evidence is not so clear, it might be a question of real debate then, but it isn't now. We're too close to it. So what about the historical existence of Jesus? I think the evidence is fragmentary and equivocal, and as Collingwood said, there is a history of events, but there's also a history of propaganda. So not every narrative is necessarily told because it's true. And I don't mean that it's insidious. If it's not true, there are a number of ways. I once had a student who was a real radical fundamentalist, and I was talking about the parables in a New Testament class, and I said, of course, Jesus wasn't saying what had actually happened. He didn't read about the parable. He didn't read about the prodigal son in the latest issue of the Galilee Gazette. He's making up the story to bring across a point. Well, this student, she was just outraged and said I was calling Jesus a liar and would answer for it on the day of judgment. She just never learned what a parable is. And so there are narratives that you have to weigh. Are they supposed to be history or not? It's hard to tell sometimes. So this makes it impossible for me to think that one can rule dogmatically on whether there was or was not a historical Jesus. I tend to find the evidence more adequately, more plausibly explained by saying that there wasn't a historical Jesus, that it was a collection of beliefs and texts and so forth, rewrites, most of it, rewrites of Old Testament stories about Elijah, Elisha, Moses, Joshua, and so forth, with the names changed, but the elements still pretty clearly identifiable. I think the hero archetype that is found in many different religions, cultures, etc., the Jesus story conforms to it too darn well with nothing left over. The few apparent connections of Jesus with known figures like Pilate and Herod Antipas and so forth, upon closer examination, turn out to be probably unhistorical, and scholars who never would have considered mythicism have argued this. It's not just an ad hoc hypothesis for mythicism. So it seems to me there were even popular novels of the period where the hero was condemned to be crucified, or actually was crucified but survived it. And there are all manner of parallels and so on that seem to me to place this into a fictional / legendary genre. It's not absolutely for certain, but the fact that it all seems so much at home with this analogous material that isn't historical, it seems to me that the best reading of it is that there wasn't a historical Jesus, though there might have been. I mean, I just don't think there's enough evidence to suggest it, much less to convince one of it. Now, by saying not enough to suggest it, of course, I know there are loads of narratives in the Gospels that star a man named Jesus. That is suggesting that there was a historical Jesus. But I think it's the same case with Abraham and Moses, the Buddha, and various other figures that mean a lot to a lot of people. But the materials upon which their faith is based seem to me non-historical. So I think there probably was no Moses, no Buddha. There's even a case to be made that there was no historical Muhammad. It doesn't matter to me one way or the other. I see great value in the Gospels and the Bible and a lot of other texts. They're fine with me. I love all the religions. I don't hate them. I love theology. I don't find it laughable like, what's his name? Richard Dawkins does. I have criticisms of it, but sometimes you have to criticize something to analyze it, to explain the Trinity doctrine. You can't leave out criticisms of it. You may think it survives the criticism or it doesn't, but you have to criticize to scrutinize, I guess is what I mean. I know apologists like to say that there's ample documentation for Jesus outside the New Testament, but even if the statements, brief as they are, by Tacitus and Josephus, are actually by those authors, and there is really good reason to doubt it. Though again, no time machine in the garage, can't go back and find out for sure. But even if they are authentic, neither of these guys was in a, and even if there was a historical Jesus, these guys were in no position to know anything about him. They were writing decades too late. And of course the notion of, but there wouldn't have been time for a mythical Jesus to be developed. When are you starting that reckoning? With the birth or the death of Jesus? That's completely circular. If Jesus was a myth, there's no known origin point. If Jesus was the latest mutation of a common myth of a dying and rising God, then when are you going to start the Jesus legend with Osiris thousands of years before? I mean, it's meaningless to use that argument, which is just borrowed from apologetics for the accuracy of the Gospels, right? When people say that given when Jesus lived, there wouldn't be enough time for all this to develop. Well, yeah, but you can't use that here because that is the very point at issue. Did he exist? But at any rate, even if there was a Jesus at that time, Josephus and Tacitus can't be shown to have known anything but current Christian beliefs about him. In fact, there are various reasons for thinking the Testimonium Flavianum is based on the Gospel of Luke, and that it was written by Eusebius, and so forth. I won't bore you into a coma with all of that, but even the sentence structure of the Testimonium versus that of the adjacent Pilate stories in Josephus shows this was not the same author, and so forth. The Suetonius, in the Lives of the 12 Caesars, he refers to Claudius expelling the Jews from Rome because of rioting instigated by one Chrestus. Well, that was a common name. It could have been garbled from Christos, but it's a common name, and it implies that this was a contemporary figure in Claudius's time. There's no reason to think this is supposed to be Jesus. Pliny the Younger, in his epistle to Trajan, says that these Christians sing a hymn to Christos as to a god. Well, yeah, we know they did that in the 2nd century. That really has nothing to do with a historical Jesus or not. And to say that Christian writers are referring to, attesting the existence of a historical Jesus, that's completely circular. It's amazing how there is virtually nothing about any historical life of Jesus in any of the epistles, and statements are made like in Romans 13 and in 1 Peter about how now we all know that the Romans don't persecute the righteous, just the wicked. Can these writers have even known about the story of Pontius Pilate condemning Jesus? There's all sorts of strange paradoxes if you think there was a historical Jesus. These things are not ad hoc hypotheses. For instance, why is Jesus not quoted by Paul and others? I know there's a couple of places where it says the Lord said, not me. But that's begging the question too, because we know from the book of Revelation and the Nag Hammadi text that people were receiving supposed revelations from the ascended Christ. So you can't be sure of that. And though Christians, you can't assume Christians are lying about Jesus because they are big Jesus fans. You can't discount that as evidence, but the fact that there is such a likely bias of faith, it's like quoting an apologist as attesting the existence of Jesus. Well, of course they believe it, and they're not lying, but that really has no evidential value. And the notion that because a theory is held by a minority of scholars, it can't be true. This is the most blatant fallacy of the appeal to the majority or the appeal to consensus. People used to think that, what's his name, who came up with continental drift theory, they used to say this guy's a kook. And just because the continent's outlines seem to fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, he's nuts. And then eventually they realized, oh my gosh, he was right. Now we got plate tectonics. Is mythicism an example of that? Will it one day be vindicated? I don't know. But it might be more like that than like Mary Baker Eddy and Christian Science, right? Where they don't believe in medicine and so forth. That seems to be kind of indefensible, and no wonder they don't teach it in medical school. So is mythicism more like that? It might be, but again, it's always a question of evaluating the evidence and of approaching it as inductively as you can. When you say that most Bible scholars believe there was a historical Jesus, is it a coincidence that almost all of them teach at religious-sponsored institutions? Even Bart Ehrman, he was once an evangelical and before that a fundamentalist. His doctoral advisor, Bruce Metzger, was an extremely sophisticated fundamentalist, and Bart's positions are much like his. Yet Metzger and Bart Ehrman are both great scholars in their proper field, which is textual criticism and so forth. I won't live long enough to have the expertise in these fields that Bart does, but I think he's appealing to the fallacy of consensus. And so that's a huge problem with it. With this view, and you constantly hear it, or the ad hominem fallacy, where he begins by just ridiculing people that believe in the Christ myth theory. That is really unhelpful and discredits your own view because it makes it look like you're just axe grinding. And especially when we hear, well, these people are only in it because it's an excuse to evade God. Are you a mind reader? Do you have telepathy and you know why I hold these views? You say, well, they found religion repressive and so they rejected it. Well, I know there are plenty of people like that. A lot of atheists, a lot of Satanists got so sick of what they perceived as oppressive religion, they're just striking back at it, and that's kind of adolescent. I do not feel that way. I still respect religious believers. In fact, Gary Habermas I consider a personal friend. Mike Licona, I know him less well, but I think very highly of him. Greg Boyd, a lot of these guys, they've become friends of mine. Bob Siegel, a lot of the people I've debated, I've become good friends with. And I don't think necessarily that, well, they have to say what they're saying. I don't know that, and I don't care. I don't care if anybody else ever accepts mythicism. If it ever does triumph, it'll be after I'm dead and gone. I'm not rooting for a team here. It's just that this is my considered possibly false opinion. It's not a battle of good and evil as far as I'm concerned. I just think the burden of proof is on the one that says there was a historical Jesus, and so far I don't think they have successfully carried that burden. But again, let my last word be, I might be wrong.